This is the Wandering Mike.
Welcome everyone to the Wandering Mike. Today I'm here with David. Hey David, how you doing?
Great, Mike. Nice to talk with you.
Nice. Yeah, I'm looking forward to this. Think we're gonna cover a interesting topic, and it's gonna be nice, fresh insights on that. So to start us off, if you just want to introduce yourself to the people, tell us a little bit about yourself, your life, your journey, whatever you want to share.
Okay, great. Well, Mike, my name's David Auge. I am an environmental specialist focusing on sustainability. And I've been doing this particular service, this particular occupation for about 35 years. The majority of the time I've been working within industry, helping them to understand and then comply with different requirements that are placed on industry in order to be sustainable, in order to meet the requirements, and then to go beyond those requirements to not only meet the letter, but the spirit of the law. Over that 35 years, I've found that communicating this to the next generation is not as easy as it might seem. Most people run to the end of the line of how are we going to do this, as opposed to looking more deeply into the why. And that's the reason for the book, Mike. I wrote a book called Man's Search for Sustainability. And the concept is that there is a searching for it. There is a desire to be sustainable. There is a focus on that very concept, but understanding the search, in particular, the why be sustainable, is an important concept I want others to understand. It's helped me be successful in this field because I start there. I start at the observation portion of what we need to do to be sustainable, and then move to the interpretation, and then eventually to the application, the how are we going to do it. As background, that's what I've been doing for the past 3 decades. So that's the reason for the book. And that's also, I guess, the reason for our conversation.
Right. Um, so maybe to start at the very beginning of your journey, career into sustainability, what was it that originally drew you to that field? What made you personally interested in pursuing and working in that field specifically?
Well, I have a bachelor's and a master's degree, a bachelor's degree in civil engineering, and a master's degree in environmental engineering. Those disciplines in an academic environment allowed me to look at, form an opinion, understand exactly what can be done, what is happening, and then to take that further in the positions that I've held. I started out as a design engineer within a large company, and found myself with that company being transferred into the environmental department, primarily perhaps because I was young, and second is because I did have an interest in that. And that's when I went back to school, got my master's degree in this field, and found out that I really did enjoy it. There was a fit between my desires to care for the surrounding environment, to concern with myself with the fence line and on out of the companies that I worked with, if you want to put it simply, and to somehow impact that group, so that as a company we were a good citizen in the communities where we were positioned. Let's see. From there, and if I can perhaps bring this as the story that kind of brings why the book is even there, I was at a West Point Founders meeting. It was a luncheon in the greater Houston area. And as background, Mike, I graduated from the military academy at West Point, the United States Military Academy. And we have different groups scattered throughout the United States where we meet on a routine basis, just to get to know friends and talk about current events. This was in November of 2001, shortly after the 9/11 attacks. And we had an expert within that luncheon who was an expert on the Middle Eastern affairs that we were going to soon find ourselves having to confront. And he, in his presentation, brought to the table that the fact this war was going to be different, the situations we were going to be in were going to be difficult because it kind of surrounded our concept of two words. And he said, it's understanding those two words that might be able to put this into a better perspective for you to understand. And he says, and those two words are its history. It's history. And he said, from your particular mindset as Americans, as people with a Western mindset, its history in any conversation means it's irrelevant. It doesn't matter. It's under the bridge. It's not something to concern yourself with because we need to do other things. But so he said that concept, it's irrelevant is what you're going to confront. But its history in many other parts of the world. And in this particular situation, he was looking at the Middle East because that was where he had spent years of his life and was an expert. He says its history means it is relevant. The history that brought us to this point in time to make a decision on what we're going to do from this point forward is relevant. So its history from a Western mindset is going to be a very difficult thing for you to understand because those individuals that you're going to encounter whose opinion you're going to attempt to change in what we're going to do for, the next year, the next decade is going to be impacted by the fact that they see life from a different point of view. And that's the reason I brought that to the table for this book, because there's a lack of observation within our normal mindset. We don't look at historical issues with them or our belief that they have any value for us to make a decision from. And in the conflict that was in the Middle East, in particular, we seem to have fought a 1-year war 20 times and confronted a situation where there was a lot of frustration on all sides. And I always believed in my mind, it went back to the fact that that expert said, Americans see, or the Western mindset sees, its history as the envelope of it's irrelevant, where we shouldn't.
Right. So you already mentioned as well that the why is very important to you, and obviously, I agree with almost everything. The why should be the most important thing. Obviously, you can discuss how to do things. You can discuss, yeah, for certain procedures, but the why is ultimately the motivation and is ultimately the important thing if something, in my opinion, also succeeds or not.
Yeah, and maybe I should bring that to light, the why portion of it.
Yeah.
Okay, the book that I wrote is called Man's Search for Sustainability. It's a similar title to a book by Viktor Frankl. His book is Man's Search for Meaning. And I found from his book a quote. He quotes Nietzsche, if you're familiar with his writings. Nietzsche says, he who has a why to live for can bear almost any how. He who has a why to live for can bear almost any how. Are you familiar with Viktor Frankl?
So I do know of the book. I know what it is about. I have never read it.
Okay.
So
Well, let me tell you a little bit about Viktor Frankl as a background to the book that he wrote. Viktor Frankl was an Austrian neurologist and a psychologist who found himself in in the situation, the thrust of the German concentration camps of World War II. Um, what happened was that he was for about 3 years in 4 different camps there in Stadt, Auschwitz, Kaufering, and Turkheim. He lost his father in the
yeah.
Terezin ghetto. He lost his brother and mother in Auschwitz. His wife died in Bergen-Belsen. His sister was able to escape. In those concentration camps, he entered as a doctor. He was a psychologist, and they put him in the infirmaries. And he was there, besides on different work details that he writes about in the book. where he had a chance to see individuals up front who were confronted with the desire to see one more day of life and not take their life. I mean, everything around them wanted them to just cease to live. And because of that challenge for uh, the aspect of sustainability, they had to make a decision. They had to make a decision to, to get better, to continue to push on just one more day in those very horrific situations. And he found out that they did so for three reasons. They continued to live, and there were a lot of people that didn't. There was a lot of people who just gave up and said, "This is the end of it. I just can't continue through this." He found that they continued to live because they had something to do. There was something in their mind, a book to write, a song to compose, a poem to write, and that was just so enveloping in their very person that they needed to continue. He found a second group that had in their heart there being a desire to be with someone else, whether it be a wife or a husband or children or an elderly parent, that desire, that drive to be and hold the hand of that person was so strong that they had to continue their life at least one more day. And the third part, which he kind of emphasizes in this book about man's search for meaning, was that there was a grasp that something bigger was about than their just existence. They're taking another breath, a larger story upon which they had conceived must be there. It must be something beyond themselves that they're just a part of. And it was that portion of a why. Why am I here? Why is this situation the one I find myself? And why am I here still breathing? And from that portion of grasping for a why, he continued to push forward, at least in his book, that there was a why to sustain that life one more moment. Now, what I did is I found that why was also similar in the grasping of sustainability. Mike, I've been doing this for over 3 decades. And most of the time when people come to me, because I'm an engineer, I'm a professional engineer, I deal with, things that have to do with architectural designs or different types of energy systems and the like. They usually come to me looking at the how, but they miss the fact that there has to be a why question in this before you get to the how, primarily because the word sustainability is normative in its structure. Like you've heard of something as more or less beautiful, more or less uh, spicy, more or less, let's see, entertaining. Well, sustainability is a normative term as well. Things become more or less sustainable. It's not like most people would say a destination. It's a journey. And to become more sustainable, to move ourselves down that path, we need to look at it as a journey, as a point of which to make a decision of what are we going to do to sustain our existence, our systems, our very, culture or community from this point to the next. And what I do is because most people get very, very, I think, upset. Usually when you put something like the word sustainable on the table, they say, "Oh, we're going to have some political discussions." I try and present this with the idea of let's look at insect communities. Let's look at a third community that's not in any way human. And let's look and evaluate them. Let's look at one that we think is just the most magnificent community that's out there. Actually, in the United States, it shows up on emblems all over the place. We have state flags with honeybees in the very center of the bag of the flag.
All right.
Yeah, in the state of Utah, if you go there, there's a hive in the very center of the
Mm.
state flag. 26 different states in this country find the insect, which is Apis mellifera. It's actually a European. That's the origin, actually, from Africa to Europe, as the state insect. It's not native to the United States, but it's been chosen as the state insect. And many times it's used as the promotion of the society that we all need to obtain. Now, Mike, on the other end of the spectrum is the desert locust. And the desert locust is seen as the most horrific of all insects because, I mean, it's recognized as something that would bring a plague of biblical proportions. If you have locusts on your horizon, if you've got locusts coming into your country, well, you better watch out because you may soon be eaten out of house and home. So those are the two spectrums. From a human perspective, we'd say, oh yeah, let's be like the bee on the locust. Let's not be like the locust. Why don't we look at both of them from inside their community? And then let's have a discussion based upon this of why they do what they do and learn from it. And the gist of my book is then to have a question of why we do from looking at these two extremes along that continuum of insects that humanity seems to either hate or love. I know that was a lot,
Yeah.
Mike. Did that
So
help?
no, it actually did because the question I was going to ask was also um, why you focused on insects rather than maybe humans, and you already answered that question, so that's good. Um, so to follow up, what would you say is the key difference between those two insect communities, the bees and the locusts?
Well, let's first start with what's similar about them. They're both very large. And that's usually what you need to start with. That's because most people know little to nothing about both. They might know a little bit about honeybees because, you can get a Langstroth hive, you can go through local beekeeping training, and you can very quickly find yourself in a community of beekeepers. So people are familiar with that, but perhaps not completely. There is a hierarchy within this structure. There's a symphony of interaction within that particular community that just is delightful to see. I mean, the queen lives for 2 to 5 years. The workers live for about 6 weeks. The worker bees find themselves between 4 to 7 different jobs within that community. There's a balance of what they produce, how they interact, how they communicate. All of those things just are a marvel to most of us as we look at that. On the other end of the spectrum, people don't usually look at locusts and just how, but they do look at it and how it can possibly destroy them to get them to stop doing what they're doing, especially in Northern Africa. But the locust is interesting itself because it is one of the few communities that requires an United Nations um, organization, an effort through the UN to keep it under control. On one, we're trying to usually lift up honeybees. We're trying to lift up those communities because bees are necessary for the pollination of so much of the food we eat. On the other end of the spectrum, we're trying to suppress um, locusts and their efforts when they do swarm of eating everything that we would like to eat ourselves. So from a human perspective, we put them both in that regard. Now, what we learn from them, though, is that they interact differently. The honeybee, like I mentioned, is very structured. There's an elegant interaction within the community that finds itself something you would most likely want to emulate. Um, there are some not so nice things about how they interact with communities next door, but we can talk about that shortly. The locust, in contrast, and there's an elegance there too, as they work within themselves. They seem to um, find themselves moving in particular directions, usually downwind or to lower pressure areas or to areas that they can fly to that have a greater vegetation. They appear to be able to migrate and find themselves migrating based upon certain stress, which seems to strengthen, not weaken their efforts. That requires us once again to interact and control them. But that particular strength has to be suppressed by us for us as humans to be able to live on the same planet with locusts. The other one, honeybees, we're actually having to hold them up. We're lifting them up. We're in many ways trying to deal with varroa mites or wax moths or hive beetles or a number of different diseases that seem to just ravage that particular community because of the fragility that it has in order to do what it's doing. So why did I put them both on the table? One we love, but it's very fragile. One we hate, the desert locust, but seems to be extremely strong. Let's learn from both of them to how they manage stress, how they allocate work, how they make decisions, how they maintain balance within their particular communities and going forward. And also just how they communicate within themselves, within those communities, so that they can learn from one another and make decisions. Those, Mike, are pretty much the reason for the book. And it's the way I broke down the book. I want to talk about stress. And then, of course, not only talking about these two communities, trying to get people to take the next step. We learn from them, and not just do it from
Right.
something, oh, we just need to back off and wrestle with one another. No, let's both learn. Let's learn along the entire spectrum, the strengths and the weaknesses of both.
So, um, what what just came to my mind there is, and I don't know if that question makes a lot of sense, but from what you just described, the locust being very persistent and like overcoming everything, and the bee being very fragile. Obviously, the bee being fragile has a lot to do with the human as well, I suppose. But um, w- what in my head that would mean that the locust is actually more sustainable than a community that is pretty fragile, or is that nonsense?
No, no, there are certain strengths that they have that make them appear to be more sustainable. Let's look at the idea of stress. Um, the stress that can be placed on a beehive could require them to, because of their home, to migrate to a second home. There's only about a 60% success rate
Mm.
when one hive decides to become two. They do it in a very elegant fashion, but they have to find a new home. And in their going to a new home, let me back up, Mike. What happens every spring is that a hive will kind of assess, and usually the queen is the one that's doing the assessing. I mean, with the hive as rest as well, just how much resources they have, just how large of a tree trunk that they're in, just how much additional space is there for them to live through this upcoming summer and winter season. If she finds it to be inadequate, she will take it upon herself to begin the process of migration. She will take approximately 60% of the hive. They will leave the hive and go to a tree nearby. It could be within 100 yards, it could be within a mile or so. And that particular group of bees, usually about 15,000 or so, will spend the next 24 to 72 hours looking for a new home. There will be a debate taking place on the outside of the hive as the foragers, who are now scouts, look for those new homes. And during the interaction, they will fly out, they will find and inspect and bring back the information to the rest of the hive. They will communicate that success with a certain dance. That dance will indicate the location, and the intensity of that dance will indicate their energy that this is the best of all possible options that they have before them. Other bees will be doing the same thing. And on the outside of this ball of 15,000 or so bees, a decision, a debate will be taking place, which then allows them to move. Now, it's very elegant. It's very well done with the bees, but only about 60% of the time is it successful. The stress of their going through that, of their moving, their entire operation is also being confronted by, let's say it rains during the fact that they are hanging from a branch somewhere. Well, I'll tell you, rain does not do well on a very small honeybee. It's also could be cold. They could find themselves not able to find the new location. Once they find the new location, even though it's the best that they were able to find, it may not be as strong as the one previously. All of those things
Mhm.
are ordered ways of handling stress. Good, but there's also weaknesses of frailty that's in it. Now let's go to the other side. Let's look at the locust. Now, a locust is actually a grasshopper who has undergone a certain type of a stressful environment, which has resulted in that grasshopper becoming, through a phase change, a locust. There are about 10 to 15 or so um, locusts around the planet. And those locusts and they're kind of along the spectrum. That is that this grasshopper, which is usually at night, it's by itself, finds itself in a situation that's very stressful. That stressful situation is usually uh, begins with their having a tremendous amount of food to eat. They're eating it, and then there being a slight drought, which forces these particular grasshoppers to find themselves in close proximity to other grasshoppers. Now, there's too many of them, yet the food supply is not enough to handle what they have there. Their interaction with one another thus begins the phase change. It's almost like a Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde phase change. That grasshopper, and if you're really interested in this, I talk about Boris Yurvov. He was a Russian entomologist who brought this to the surface in 1920. He was one of the first individuals to see these grasshoppers actually changing into the locust. But what happens is this locust changes
Oh,
color. It goes from a green to a yellow. It changes the brain size. Its brain actually increases by 30%. The legs become shorter and much stronger, giving it a greater dynamic, a greater physical strength in order to do what it desires to do. And then it also begins to operate together during the daytime. Usually a grasshopper is at night. It stays hidden. It does the very best it can to be in a very solitary situation. When it goes through this phase change, it becomes gregarious. It finds itself working in the daytime. It finds itself, because of the numbers, able to almost confuse or put at bay many of the predators that would want to eat a grasshopper or a locust, because it will change its diet. In some ways, it will start eating poisonous plants. It'll start moving in great numbers, and it will start to procreate at a much larger rate than it did previously. Stress, in many ways, is the reason why it then has a dynamic influence as a community to move forward. Stress was a good thing for the locust, not a bad thing. And so, anyway, those are the two things to look at. And so they've got the increased strength, they've got the congregation change, they've got the increase in numbers, and then there's an increase in their potential to make an impact on the surrounding community. Now, people stand back and say, well, I don't want it to make an impact on my community. I mean, I live in, Nigeria, or I live in somewhere in Sudan, and I don't want to find this coming over the horizon, eating what I've just attempted to plant and to grow. That's the case. But let's look at just a community of locusts. Let's look at what they've done and perhaps see that there is a strength from the stress that they've gone through. So anyway, that's an example along that spectrum. And if you want to use a human application of it, Mike, I live in North Carolina. We were talking about that before we began recording. And
yeah.
North Carolina had some pretty horrific impacts from Hurricane Helena about a month and a half ago. The
Mm.
the western part of this state, I'm in the eastern portion, um, was just devastated with floods, devastated with downed trees and roads that were blocked. And as a result, there were many communities over there that found themselves isolated. Cell towers are down. People couldn't understand the road systems. The only people they had to depend upon were the neighbors nearby. And they found all of a sudden, through this stressful situation, that they could depend upon those neighbors. They could, that is, their community could go forward in a way that they never even thought possible, because the person nearby was willing to give them something they didn't have in the past, or care for them, or in some way reach out to them in a way that they were just blown away that someone would do so. That stress was actually to their benefit. It makes some of these communities stronger in the relationships that really, I guess, make this life worth living in some ways.
Yeah. Um, that is actually always very remarkable that in those kind of phases we really see how communities can come together again. And um, but even before the example you just brought, I was also thinking about what you said, and it is really cool for you to give us such an insight into these communities, because most of the things you mentioned I didn't know, and it's really really cool and interesting to hear about that. Um, So what I was wondering though is because we obviously don't want to have natural disasters every month, every week, just for our communities to
Right.
be under stress. So, um, what I was thinking is, do you think that us becoming more and more civilized, becoming more and more like cities, and basically reducing the stress we put ourselves under, that is a negative thing for our general development?
I don't know if it's a negative thing, but it's something perhaps to consider as to what we really gain at times. Many times in the United States, we find that coaches who push their teams to win a game, they may not be angry, but it might not be their personality of frustration or like a like a hurricane, but they are pushing them to push themselves is actually to the benefit and the growth of the team. Uh, it's almost like the difficulties do have a benefit that we have lost sight of. It's not comfort that seems to bring us forward, but sometimes just an exercise of a muscle. Our muscles seem to grow when they're placed under stress and strain. And from that stress and strain, they are suffering and becoming stronger. It's it's not always that way. I mean, there are some detrimental effects to having too much stress and too much strain. I wouldn't want anyone to have to go through that. I mean, post-traumatic stress disorder is actually linked to too much of that. But there is a certain measure of growth that difficulties do seem to tend to help um, in the growth of things. Even the bees, that they're under a stressful situation, but more so, at least in the extreme of having to deal with stress, it does seem it's been to the benefit of the locust.
Um, Another thing that also I was kind of wondering while you were telling us about these communities is obviously those insect communities, they care about where they have their shelter, they care about getting their food. And then we as humans obviously develop another thing that we need to take care of, which is energy,
Mhm.
which these insect communities don't have at all. So, from your expertise, how does that get into the thinking of sustainability as well? Because I imagine this changes the whole playbook a lot because it's a whole different area that we as humans need to focus our efforts and how we do things as well, which these insects don't have.
Well, Mike, in some ways they do. Let me bring you back to the beehive. The beehive and the environment necessary within the beehive itself to allow the eggs, which are placed there by the queen, needs a temperature of about 93 degrees year round. So in the cold parts of the year or the warm parts of the year, they have to regulate the temperature that they maintain there. And they do that through some rather unique um, ways. For example, during the very hot summer months, the bees will actually douse their body with water and they will use the wings on the outside of the hive itself to almost act as small air conditioning systems that will cool the hive down from it being too hot or too high of a temperature. During the summer months, I'm sorry, during the winter months, which we're getting ready to enter that right now, they will actually flex the wing muscles, and that creates a a generation of heat. And that heat generation of that community will allow once again the temperature to increase to once again that 93 degree Fahrenheit effort. And I know you're probably Celsius, so what is that? Is that 29 or is that 30? Well, anyway, whatever is Celsius, but
Something around there.
yeah. They have to maintain that in order for the community to be healthy. They also do, and this is interesting with the beehive, they actually will increase the temperature if there is a virus within the community, going above 100 degrees Fahrenheit in order to, almost like our own body, to drive away and through that heat to hopefully dissipate an infection or fungal growth that's occurring in that situation. They'll address like the Japanese beetles that might try to attack them. They will actually surround a beetle and increase their body temperature in order to contend with that. Those temperature variations are things that they regulate as a community, either temperature going up or temperature going down, by the energy that they produce in the situations they have. That's one of the things that seems to be so elegant about the bees is because they do understand a necessary temperature has to be maintained for the health of the community, and that they increase or decrease it based upon their own, bodily functions and efforts. So those are some of the lessons that we can learn as well from that. We can learn that the community interaction there is a necessary input to making the community well established to what it's attempting to do.
Right.
Yeah.
Um, w- well, we already, well, you brought up the hurricane, in North Carolina, and obviously it's like those natural disasters have become more and more in the last years, in the United States, in Europe as well. So do you think we need to react to that as a community? Do you think that this will increasingly get worse? Do you think that is just how nature works? What's your opinion on the development of all these natural catastrophes?
Well, perhaps it's once again going back into observing lessons from history. Um, there are lessons that have happened in the past with, um, I remember the standing stones of Japan that were something that were placed into their communities to make sure people didn't build beyond that, closer to the shorelines in Japan, so that they would be impacted from typhoons, or in that particular situation, it had to do with earthquakes, which would result in tidal waves hitting the, the island of Japan, that we have forgotten, that we have failed to learn the lesson so that we can take it to the next generation. I think that can perhaps be helpful. If you saw some of the areas that were constructed in the mountains of North Carolina, the beautiful homes, but there's a point of construction where you really need to think twice about just what type of long-term impact you want that structure to have for you. I have a certification in leads. I'm leads and green globes. Are you familiar, Mike, with leads? That term?
Not particularly, if you could explain.
Okay, LEED stands for Leadership in Energy and Environmental Design. It's primarily something that architects would bring to the table as their expertise in making
Mm.
sure that the building to be constructed has um, been really thought through as to its long-term use and effort, so that it's a healthy building on the inside for those that want to work there. And also it's something that would last for 50 to 100 to a couple hundred years. The background that most of the training I went through to get my lead certification had to do with the houses or the structures in Europe that were built of stone back in the 14th, 15th, and 16th century that were still available and in use today. Buildings where someone who had constructed them had thought long term. That's where I think we need to gain more of that. And the leads buildings that I've been a part of took that into account and started to think holistically of how does it fit in the environment, and what impact will the sun or the positioning of it, how about the use of the building after our efforts to use it are no longer necessary? Where does it then fit into the next community 50, 100 years from now? Those are all things that are good, but there needs to be more of that and more of a long-term influence about about the decisions we make.
Um, yeah, so that's obviously also a interesting question, because you said long term. And for a lot of people, I suppose thinking 100 years ahead is maybe already very long term. So if we are actually talking about sustainability, and what kind of range are you thinking about? Because obviously, if we as humans want to be around for a while, this includes a lot of next generations, doesn't it?
Yes, it does. Yeah, it does. You're trying to look, let's see, within a community for, let's just talk about office buildings in Europe or something like that. The occupancy of that building long term would be that the building's function may change. It may go to a different organization, but its structure has been made so that it won't be falling apart as a result of just a poor construction or mold growth or um, the positioning of it and the lack of energy to heat or to cool it might change so that you have made it to be able to get through those changes and see 100 years from now is still a useful building. Those are all things to be considered, and they do a good job. I mean, anybody who receives a lead certification, I'm a lead associate professional, has had to go through those discussions, those examples, and understand the long-term effort of what they're trying to put on the ground. It's not just for the next 10 or 20 years. It's got to be for that 100 years effort. Will it succeed? Will the building be here in 100 years? You don't quite know that. You don't have a crystal ball, but you have to start with the idea that it could.
Yeah. Um, that's is that something that is also taken into considerations, especially if we're talking about energy production? Because again, I believe that this is a very important topic, and it seems to be so that we are kind of going into where we are wanting to consume more and more energy, and we're developing all this technology. So obviously, we need to be able to feed this technology with energy. Um, is that also that they're thinking about 100-year spectrum, or is it more of a short term thinking in that kind of field?
But it's the different types of energy options that you have on the table are always going to be, I shouldn't say always going to be changing, but they are going to be changing. There's an ecological concept called carrying capacity. It has to do with maximum sustainable yield that kind of flows from it. But what you're trying to do is trying to figure out what carrying capacity the system put into place and the energy provided to it can provide. Um, we used to burn wood and coal in order to heat homes. So we did so for a number of years. And then there was the recirculation of the heat, the flue gas from those particular uh, uh, ovens that allowed that the energy used, the wood and the coal combusted would actually heat a greater space for a longer period of time. That increased the sustainable yield of what you were able to get out of a certain cubic foot or cubic yard of coal or fuel. Those began to change with time. And you found certain uses of fuel. For example, right now, a gallon of gasoline can give you so much miles or a yield of effort. That changes as we become more efficient in the motors that we put on the table for us to use. So that balance right there is something you're continually having to push and to find how the fit will best make use of that. I guess, Mike, here, what we're all coming against and kind of having to contend with it is a paradox, if you would. There's a paradox of our use
Mm.
of energy and a paradox of our use of the resources we have here. Have you heard of the paradox of the commons? Have you heard
Call.
of that? Okay,
I, I don't think so.
you have okay. Okay, imagine a shared pasture where everyone is just free to graze their cattle. Sounds ideal, right?
Yeah.
Okay, but here's the catch. If everyone acts self-interested, the pasture gets overgrazed and eventually destroyed. Individuals acting
Right.
independently, according to their self-interest, will slowly deplete that shared resource. And even though it's clearly against everyone's long-term best interest to do so, we've got an issue. It indulges the notion that individual action always leads to the best collective outcome, that we will all individually do the right thing. And as a result, on this spectrum of things, most people would say, you know what? Those locusts way on the other end, they're kind of the example that the paradox of the common is a real paradox because we're going to consume everything in sight if we don't look through this. But at the other end of the spectrum, there's also something called the paradox of the invisible hand. And these are two things, Mike, that kind of butt up to each other in the environmental arena of what we're talking about. Now, the paradox of the invisible hand, as opposed to the commons, has to do with your imagining that the world where everyone acts in self-interest, somehow society seems to benefit from that. Now here's the example. Let's say a baker bakes bread to earn a living. He's, he doesn't want to do that to feed the community. He just wants to make a living. And by doing so, the baker provides food for a whole bunch of people. The paradox reveals a fascinating aspect of human behavior. It suggests that our ambitions can unintentionally benefit others, raising questions about the balance between self-interest and societal good. Can we rely solely on self-interest to drive progress, or do we need a guiding hand to ensure fairness and sustainability? You know, that's once again, when you look at these two particular things on the table, you'll say, oh, David, you've given me the locust. I know that's going to be a mess because eventually they're going to run out of food to eat. They're all going to die. And so is everybody else in their particular situation. But there's on the other end of the spectrum, you've got the honeybee, which is extremely fragile. Um, we've got something there, but everything seems to be fine now. What do we do with these two paradoxes? Is it the invisible hand of those honeybees, which now, having searched for honey, they pollinated the gardens, they pollinated the crops, and those crops have then benefited us? Is that the invisible hand, and the paradox of the commons being the locust? That's what I want, Mike, for people to look at, to observe these things. Um, both of them are out there. Both of those are being confronted day in and day out. And that conversation, that element of discussion is what this book hopefully brings to the table. It's getting people to observe first, and then find a general rule as they attempt to interpret what they've seen, and then go to the how. How are we going to apply this? That's where we need to be in this discussion. We need to go all the way through that and hopefully learn from it.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, and that was a really, really good insight. Um, I, I'm just trying to maybe get a couple of more bee and locust stories out of you. So I don't know if with the question I asked, if you already answered it in the stories before, but I would just want to ask you, like, what is the most remarkable thing, or what is the thing that excited you most, both about the bees and the locust? What is the one thing where you were like, "Oh wow,
Yeah, about each of those communities. All right.
yeah,
Let's okay, let me talk about the communication example of the locust. Um, the locust have just absolutely tremendous eyes. If you look at the angle of which their eyes can look forward, uh, uh, left or to the right, and then up and down, it's over 180 degrees. It's almost like the entire wall in front of them plus a little bit behind, can be seen by this insect at the same time. As a result, they have and the brain, as it increases in size, 30% larger than when they were grasshoppers. Um, they have a lot of that brain being utilized by their eyes. Those eyes allow them to see and react by the examples of those that are around them. Unlike the bees who have a queen in charge, the locusts do not. The locusts are completely independent, one of the other. There's almost a social networking effort that allows them to go forward or retreat or to follow the what's called the downwind or the lower pressure efforts that where they can seek additional food. That social networking interaction is just absolutely tremendous for their strength because of these eyes and their ability to keep their view on everyone around them. They can interact and move with everyone around. And we're talking locust um, swarms that are just absolutely monstrous. Now, the largest group of locusts ever seen actually occurred in the United States over the state of Nebraska in 1875. There are no longer any
Oh,
locusts in the United States. They're they went extinct because of much of the farming aspects of what happened. But this in 1875, there were a total of, and this is in over the state of Nebraska. There was a meteorologist. His name was Alfred Childs, who, with the equipment necessary, saw a swath of locusts that was 110 miles in width, 1 mile deep, flying overhead for a period of 10 days. They landed in the state, or they started to land in the state of Missouri, in Iowa, in upper portions of Wisconsin. It pretty much devoured everything in sight. Those states declared a state of emergency. They tried to harness all the people necessary to try and interact and push back against these insects, and were relatively successful. But there were a number of people who died. Have you ever heard of Laura Ingalls Wilder and Little House on the Prairie?
I heard of it.
Okay,
Um,
and it was an author. She wrote books, and one of the books she writes, I think it's anyway. I can't remember exactly the title, but she talks in that book about the locust swarms that are coming down and devouring every single thing on their farm, and that was in 1875 when this event was taking place. But that goes back to communication. These insects were just incredibly able to keep track of what every other insect around them was doing. And, the parallel, of course, Mike, would be our own social networking efforts that now allow us as humans to see certain things, to be able to have communication to us in such a short period of time very quickly. And that's kind of the example of how there's a strength to it, but there's also somewhat of a weakness to it as well. So as a story of that I have in the book, I find that one absolutely fascinating. And I talk about in the book about their ability to stay together, their ability uh, to maintain a certain strength as a group as they move through that as a result of those situations. So anyway,
yeah.
there's a story, Mike, about locusts.
Yeah, maybe if you can answer that same question, if you haven't answered it in a story before for the bees as well, that was exciting. Why not?
Okay. Um, let's see. The communication efforts of a bee um, are numerous. They communicate through humming, through dancing, and they can see certain colors. There's a pheromone that they transfer through the hive that communicates the health of the queen. All of these are necessary pathways by which this insect, very small. I mean, if you ever see Apis mellifera, the honeybee, it's not the largest of bees that are out there. They're able to successfully keep things in order. Now, one of the things that's fascinating is that the average hive, and I am a beekeeper, so I have hives here where I live, and I have them also at work. So I interact with them on a routine basis. But the the bee themselves actually will communicate through the humming that things are not all well in Mudville. Not all well in beehive, if you want to put it that way. What they will do, let's say for a queen, if a queen gets sick or if she in some way becomes hurt, uh, they will, within 20 minutes, know that to be the fact within the entire. That piece of information has been told to every single bee, and we're talking somewhere between 20 to 50,000 within 20 minutes. Because they will now know that, they have to reproduce another queen. The queen is actually a worker bee that's fed something called royal jelly. It's a diet change that will make the bee itself, a worker bee, develop a different type of DNA, and she will grow to maturity in about a 14-day period of time, and leave the cell where she's been birthed, and come out and actually fight with the other queens that have been produced at the same time. And the winning queen out of that particular group will take over the responsibility of leading that hive into the future.
Oh,
But that interaction, that humming, is one way that the communication is taking place within that hive. That change is occurring and needs to be addressed. Anyway, that's one story. I
that,
mean, I've got a lot more I can talk about, but yeah, I'm fascinated in that. I've also been to my hives and gone out there and they're humming loud, and I go, I'm going to back off today because as soon as I open that up and start looking at the frames, they're going to get mad at me, and I'm going to have them all over me. I've been stung, and sometimes when you get stung a lot, you say, I think I need to do this another day.
yeah, that was actually super cool. The story of how they produce their queens. Um, but obviously also the communication, but I wasn't aware um, that they actually produce their queens, that it's just a worker bee becoming a queen, basically.
Yeah. They'll do about 10 to 15 or so cells where the queen will be, where queen bees will be birthed from. And then there can only be one queen per hive. So the first one that comes out, we usually go around and sting those that are either newly coming out of their hives or those that have. So it's, it's kind of cutthroat in a way, but I mean, they still just, that's the structure, is they have to have one queen, and she will be the queen of that entire, she's the mom of that entire structure, which includes workers. 99 point, I don't know, 99.9% of them will be female bees, and she will actually make that decision upon which eggs she will place into each cell. And a very small number will be drones, which are the male bee.
Right.
Anyway,
Yeah. So, like you said, you have many more stories, and I could probably just listen to those stories for another hour. But I do appreciate you telling us all these insights, and at least I can say for myself that you actually made me very interested in those communities, and it is really cool to hear those stories. And I also very much like that you just want to put these questions out there because these philosophical questions that you portrayed are very interesting to talk about. Sometimes, yeah, we don't really need to put value on one thing or the other, but just look at how different communities do it and then go from there. So, um, for all the people that listened that are also now as interested as I am, if you at the end just want to tell us again where they can find the book, where they can find you, and then obviously I will put all the links in the description as well for them to go there and see.
sure. Well, Mike, my name's David Auge. It's a French name, which means you can, the way it's pronounced is nothing like the way it's spelled. It's David, Auge. And if you look in
Right.
Amazon, you'll see the book that I've written. I say there's also a website that's davidaugebooks.com. It's plural because I'm writing another one now that's dealing with sustainability. Um, as well. But I currently just have this one out there. And please buy the book and begin these conversations. We seem to learn after the observation aspect has really been looked at closely. Then we interpret from what we've observed, and then we apply. And we need to go through that entire step process: observe, interpret, apply, before we then say, and that's the answer, and that's what we got to do. We need to observe. We need to learn, like from these two communities.
Right. I suppose you don't want to tease what the second book is going to be about.
Well, let me give you a little bit of background. I can give you a little bit. Let's see. Um, my heritage goes back to the mountains of Colorado. There are ski slopes right now in Colorado, Breckenridge being one of them, where my grandfather was a gold miner. He was on crews that were digging holes in the ground up there, doing what's called a placer, which is just panning for gold. Um, and he lived there for quite a few years. There's some certain aspects about Breckenridge still being there. Most efforts to mine for anything anywhere in the world usually dry up when whatever they mined for is gone. The whole purpose for the town was that one purpose, to mine for gold or for silver. Why did this town continue? What was the sustainability efforts that the people that led that town put into place so that it didn't just dry up and blow away? Now, of course, it changed with time, and now it's a ski slope in a skiing community. But there were other reasons why that town, as opposed to the other ones in the area, survived. And that's what the book's going to be about. Can we learn something from Breckenridge, Colorado? Sustainability.
Cool. That sounds very interesting as well. So yeah, but anyway, thank you um, for sharing all your insights, all your stories, and your experiences with us. It was really, really interesting, and I enjoyed the conversation.
I did too, Mike. Thanks a lot for the questions.
Of course. So, David, have a beautiful rest of your day, and bye, everyone.
Goodbye.